I see in Sabah, the interesting thing is the civil society movement is quite thriving. That is a good thing because if you have a thriving civil society movement, you can use this third force to put pressure on the political class. Because the political class, if you don't put pressure on them, they would tend to do things that are not aligned with our aspiration.
Welcome to the Sabah Matters podcast by Deal Express, where we explore ideas, people, and policies shaping the future of Sabah. And I'm your host, Adiputra. Today's guest is, I would consider one of Malaysia's foremost political scientists, especially when it comes to anything on Borneo politics. We have Dr. Arnold Puyok. He is a senior lecturer in politics and government studies at University of Malaysia Sarawak, UNIMAS, whose work focuses on Malaysian politics, federal-state relations, the many elections that we've been having, and notably public policy, with an emphasis and focus on Borneo politics, Sabah and Sarawak. His research has been published by institutions including ISEAS, Yusof Ishak Institute, and he has become one of the most sought-after commentators on Sabah and Sarawak politics, frequently appearing in national and international media to help make sense of the region's evolving political landscape. Dr. Arnold, thank you for joining us, and welcome to Sabah Matters. Glad to have you. I think I want to just nail on the hammer on the head first, because you came back to present a talk to the Sabah Society on the nature of autonomy. The title is The Two Autonomies, right? So how can you say Sabahan autonomy differs from Sarawakian autonomy? And maybe you could give us a brief summary on what you've presented at the Sabah Society.
Yeah. Thank you, Adi, for having me. So basically, this talk was based on my ongoing research on autonomy in Sabah and Sarawak. I'm interested in trying to unpack the issue of why is it Sarawak seems to be more ahead of us in terms of its struggle for autonomy. I'm not saying that Sabah is not successful. We are successful somehow, but it seems like the autonomy trajectory of Sabah is much slower compared to Sarawak. Now, why this is an important question to ask, because both of these autonomies are fighting for the same thing, based on MS-63, right? And MS-63 is embedded in the constitution. We have our rights written in the constitution. But why is it Sabah is more advanced? Sarawak is more advanced, more successful in comparison to Sabah. So that is the heart of the talk that I was giving. Now, and then the second point that I was talking about was the fact that because Sarawak is considered as successful, we Sabahans have been told to emulate Sarawak, right? To think and act like Sarawakian if we want our autonomy to be fulfilled. Now, then I started to think, what is it about Sarawak that we should follow? Then people say that, okay, because Sarawak is led by a local-based coalition, there are no national-based parties in GPS. They are all local-based coalition. That's number one. Number two, in terms of election dominance, right? Because they managed to win elections, control the DUN, more than 90% of the seats are controlled by GPS, so they have this electoral dominance. And then secondly, what Sabah does not have, that Sarawak has, is the fact that regional identity is stronger in Sarawak. When it comes to Sarawak first, Sarawak for Sarawakian, it seems like it's stronger there. So we Sabahans, we have been asked to follow this model. The third thing in my talk was that if we were to follow Sarawak wholesale, for me, that would not be practical for Sabah. Why? Because of three reasons. Number one, when we look at Sarawak, Sarawak inherited a strong narrative that all this while they have been autonomous and independent. I think you know Sarawak's history, right? During the Brooke era, what the Brooke family did to Sarawak. They institutionalized the system. And by the time we achieved our independence in 1963, within the federation, Sarawak already inherited what I call as institutionalized territorial community. They already had a political community, and they already had a narrative that the elites can use to show up support among Sarawakians. Whereas us in Sabah, we are struggling to look for a narrative, a stronger narrative. What is it about Sabah for Sabahan? What is it about Sabah first? We do not have that. Our starting point in my argument is 1963. That's why you have figures like Stephens, Mustafa, or even the Kitingan brothers who tried very hard to consolidate this Sabah for Sabahan identity. Not so much because they wanted to create an idea of a Sabah as a Sabahan identity, but because they wanted to create this in order to tell the federal government to honor its promise. So basically, that's the main gist of my talk. We can basic.
To, to expand more on that, I guess the way you can argue that Sarawak formed as a foundation for a nation state way before Sabah. Sabah had the chartered company, right, which ran this Sabah as basically an enterprise, right? But for on that logic is that it seems that the argument for Sarawakian autonomy is driven by a very embedded political identity, whereas Sabah were coming it from a legalist perspective, right? Because we like to refer to MA63, but Sarawak they just say, it's within MA63, but we're asking for autonomy, because we believe that in the principles of federalism, right? What led to that divergence? Sarawak is more about they know that they're distinct, they know that they're different. While Sabah still goes back to the MA63 itself, right? Sabrak, rarely they bring it up unless it really matters, but they would ask for things beyond MA63. For Sabah, it doesn't, right?
Because it's interesting because when you speak to Sarawakians who are in their 50s, 60s, or even 70s, they can go way back during the Brooks era. In fact, when you listen to the political elites, they will always say that, okay, look, we are an autonomous, independent state even before Malaysia, right? So if you, as a Sarawakian, you listen to this, it means, wow, Sarawak started long ago, even before Malaysia in 1963. So in a sense, that gives them this strongest sense of attachment to Sarawak as their land. Whereas in Sabah, I don't say that we do not have a political consciousness in Sabah. In fact, we do. We fought against the British, the company, or even during the Japanese time, right? We fought very hard. But what I'm saying here is that, you see, the political elites, they do not have this strong narrative about a sense of attachment to your homeland, right? When you listen to people like Mustafa, like Stephens, or even like the Kitingan brothers, those who fight for Sabah autonomy, they're struggling to package a narrative, a stronger narrative that they sell to us. Their starting point is MS63, or even before that, 20 points, right? But in Sarawak, that's different. That is why if you are Sarawakian listening to what the elites say, you feel like you have this strong emotion towards your homeland because the story seems to be quite strongly embedded, right? In their psyche, if you like. Yes.
But not just that, would you say that because the elites in Sarawak now, they were also involved in governance during the Brooke administration, whereas the Sabahan leaders weren't necessarily involved in decision making with the company or even the crown colony, right? Like if you look at a lot of Sarawakian leaders, you can trace their alumni. A lot of them went to the same missionary school, right? So it seems that Sarawak, their leaders were already set up to inherit that, much earlier. Whereas Sabah, a lot of times it feels like governance started from scratch and everybody had to rush to figure it out.
You said it quite right because state building happened much earlier during the Brooks time. Whereas in Sabah, our state building, I would argue, only started after 1963. But in Sarawak, it's already started even much earlier. So this is the kind of foundation that Sarawak has, that makes them more, I would say, I would not say sophisticated, but more advanced in terms of institutionalization. But whereas in Sabah, we are struggling, especially after 1963. And this gives the foundation for collision like GPS, or even the political elites like Taih Mahmud, Adan Satem. And for them, it's easier to package a narrative and sell it to Sarawakians.
I feel it's only recent years we can see how institutionalization and state capacity is so pronounced in Sarawak vis-a-vis Sabah, right? But if we look at Malaya, they're always possessed by this sensibility of reductionism, right? They like to flatten Sabah and Sarawak into one particular Borneo identity, right? So maybe could you tell us why they have that proclivity? Why do they have that sensibility to just see Sabah and Sarawak as almost like the same thing when obviously what we've discussed it's almost apples and oranges. Mm.
Because in the minds of the policymakers in Malaya, um, they they look at Sabah and Sarawak as new territories that were being absorbed into the federation. So in their minds, these new territories must be integrated into the larger federal framework, right? I don't have problem with that. I mean, if you go to any federal country, that's exactly what they're doing, right? But the issue here is when you try to impose just one particular model, and then they try to impose this on Sabah and Sarawak. That is why Sabah and Sarawak protested. What kind of model? It's a model because Malaya, Peninsular Malaysia is already Muslim dominated, Malay dominated government, right? And then they're trying to import that to Sabah and Sarawak. That is why we are not happy here. Because what does a federal state mean? It means celebrating differences, right? And managing those differences. What happened in the Federation of Malaysia is that over the years, power was being slowly concentrated into the hands of the federal government. So when you do that, you are basically indirectly trying to dilute the cultural, political, and social uniqueness of Sabah and Sarawak. That's why we protested. That's why now we're talking about autonomy. Give us back our sense of identity. Give us back our uniqueness, our culture, and our freedom of religion. You're still hearing people tell that to you, right? If you Even if you go to Sarawak, I'm sure here as well.
I'm curious about how you mentioned that basically Sabah and Sarawak were almost a different entity completely, but and they also had to form a federation, right? When it was Tunku who opposed the federation itself, right? But then you have leaders like Mahathir who went through the Malay nationalism way, right? The British, the Japanese, and 57 there was Malaya, right? And then who would have thought about 6 years later, oh, we have to work, we have to join together with Singapore, Sabah, Sarawak, right? As a Malay nationalist, I never thought that this would happen. Could that also be a contributing factor? Like a lot of leaders back then, because Mahathir has never been so gracious. Let's be honest here. They've never been gracious. He rarely visits Sabah and Sarawak.
I think Mahathir believed in integration. He believed in the fact that he needed a strong hand in order to sort of dominate or control the federation. Because in the minds of Mahathir, if he win with two-thirds majority, if he is able to control the federal government, it's easier for him and for the government to develop the country. That is why for him, centralization of power was important. So coming back to my argument just now, if you centralize power too much, then you are basically destroying the very essence of a federal state. So that what happened during Mahathir's time, because Mahathir believed in centralization of power. he believed in integration of these two territories into the larger federal framework. So the aftermath, you and I feel it, especially when he was no longer in power, right? Especially under Najib, we started to try to get back our autonomy. Yeah. So I think at the end of the day, federal leadership must realize the fact that Malaysia is a federal country. There should be an element of give and take. That's number one. Number two, there should be an attempt to manage our differences. Because I think in the next 20 or 20 years or so, the most important thing for Malaysia is how do you manage these differences across the states, right? Not only in Sabah and Sarawak, even now Johor is already trying to to demand, right? And to try to assert its Bangsa Johor. After Johor, what else? Maybe Kelantan, maybe Terengganu, or maybe Penang. So I think for Malaysia, this is going to be a great challenge for us.
Going back to federalism, you see, like you said, mentioned Johor is one of them, with the special economic zone. Sarawak's already taking 10 steps every other month, right? Malacca also doing its own steps of state leadership, right? What would you say to the idea of federalism 15, 20 years down the line? How do you think policymakers and leaders in Putrajaya are going to respond to more acute expressions of state nationalism? Because it's not just Sabah and Sarawak. We're seeing it all across the other states in Malaya, right? How do you think the central government is going to contend with that 20 years down the line?
They do not have to wait until the states have the political leverage to press for more autonomy. They don't have to wait for that. In fact, they should start now by looking at areas where they can decentralize power. Should not wait until the other state become like the Borneo states where we have the political leverage, right? Political power. They should not wait for that. They should now look at the structure of the federation, in which area they can devolve, they can let the states to control. For us in Sabah and Sarawak, I think you know this as well. We want health, we want education that has been slowly given to Sarawak, for instance. Sabah, we also want the same thing. But then again, you have to understand the issue of capacity. So let's say when you want education, when you want health to be given to you, right? The next question is, do you have the capacity to manage your own health and education sector? That is another issue that needs to be unpacked. But what I'm saying is that federation should not be static. Federation should adapt according to changing circumstances, and precisely that's what Malaysia is facing at the moment. Yeah.
I definitely agree. And I think a lot of other quite centralized countries are contending with that. I think in the UK, Andy Burnham is moving towards devolving particular powers, right? And of course, the argument would be that, oh, you're at the risk of balkanizing your own country, right? But I mean, for Sabah and Sarawak, the fact that administratively we're in a completely different zone vis-a-vis Malaya, right? How can we build that capacity you mentioned? Because, okay, we get education, we get health, but we also need a way to fund it. We need a way to um, find a way to finance it, administrate it, organize it, right? Does that mean that comes with more caveats like fiscal federalism, fiscal devolution as well? Because you cannot have health and education unless some parts of finance is also given straight to Sabah, right? So how can we actually manage this whole, I would guess, a holistic devolution of powers? How do we go about doing that?
So I think the interesting thing about Sabah is that a lot of people look at us negatively because they say we are politically fragmented. So some Sarawakian look at us, they say, you should be united, you should be consolidated like GPS, right? Then it's easier for you to fulfill your autonomy or to ask the federal government to give you more. Well, I think there is a cost for us being politically fragmented, right? I think we should recognize the fact that the cost is there. What's the cost? The cost is that weakens our leverage, right? We are seen as not consolidated. But look at it the other way around. Let's turn the table around and then look at it in a positive way. Political fragmentation meaning diversity, right? Political fragmentation meaning you reduce the concentration of power in one collision, in one person. So you basically allow power to be shared by everybody, by the government, by the civil society, by the third force, and so on and so forth. So coming back to the question you asked about capacity, I think capacity will come hand in hand with stronger institutions. For me, the most important thing for Sabah is to have stronger institutions. So you can have stronger institution when you have capacity, right? So it does not matter whether you are fragmented, whether you are consolidated. If your institution is not strong, you will not be able to deliver, right? So where do we start? Coming back to your question, I think we should start where power has been devolved to us mostly. Um, I think the AG in Sabah now, they've been given more jurisdictional powers. We want to get more power in health or education. So this is where I think the state government should look into areas where the officers can be empowered, can be trained so that they are skillful in what they are doing. Send them to good university, to good training institution all over the world. Invest in them, and once they are back, they are able to help Sabah to produce stronger institutions for Sabah. So we have to have this idea that our institution must outlast our political leaders or coalition, because political leaders and coalition, they come and go, but institutions will remain there forever. So it is the institution that we should be focusing on, strengthen them, make them better at what they are doing. I think that's possible, even though we are politically fragmented, not consolidated like GPS.
I mean, going on that point of fragmentation, seeing it positively, you mentioned before it's a marketplace of democracy, right? It's almost like a bazaar of ideas, right? You have the fact that we have so many candidates, so many parties participating in the last election. Doesn't that you would think it would necessarily mean there's a more larger pool of ideas, right? But sometimes that those ideas doesn't really translate to institution building, right? Whereas in Sarawak, you can see that they're building their institutions left, right, and center, building on top of what the Brooks have left off. What can we say when it comes to how do I explain this? Because you mentioned centralization of powers, right? How can we translate this democratic marketplace of ideas to ensure that even at the state level, we have more capacity buildings in terms of institution building? I'm speaking as in, because you talk about the civil servants. What can we say about devolving further powers from the state to the local government? Because we had local elections before, right? And Sabah, you can, yeah, because in Sabah, you cannot administer it the same way you would administer Klang Valley or Penang, right? You have our own. So how would you go about that kind of argument? Because some might argue against local election, that it could be a vehicle for political patronage. But how do we strengthen that as an institution or capacity building? How would we go about that?
Yeah. So this is the low hanging fruits that a lot of people are talking about. Our power over local government, right? So I've heard some people saying that it's time for us to let local government, local council members to be elected. And I'm not too sure whether local government in Sabah can collect their own taxes. I think they can, if not mistaken. Let's check that. But if that is possible, then we use that, because we have power over local government. We are not tied to a federal law, right? So this is the low hanging fruits that Sabah should be focusing on. So maybe you can come up with a model. Pick perhaps one or two local council, elect them, or empower them to collect money, collect taxes, and see whether they can grow, right? So this is the low hanging fruit that I was talking about just now. Um, the good thing about, I mean, the positive thing, you use the word positive thing about fragmentation, is that I see in Sabah, the interesting thing is the civil society movement is quite thriving. That is a good thing, because if you have a thriving civil society movement, you can use this third force to put pressure on the political class. Because the political class, if you don't put pressure on them, they would tend to do things that are not aligned with our aspiration as the voters. But when you have a thriving civil society movement, this civil society movement can help to bridge between policy, government, and the people. I think that's a good thing for Sabah. I've seen a lot of civil society movements organizing seminar forums, or even coming up with what do you call that, posters criticizing the political class, talking about corruption, talking about governance. I think this is a good thing for Sabah. Why is it a good thing? Because a lot of people say that the opposition in the DUN, they don't play a decisive role, an effective role, right? To provide check and balance to the government. But we have an alternative, which is the civil society movement. So it is the civil society movement that will continue to educate the people, especially the young generation, like you and me. We are both young, so that we can be more aware about direction of our political future. If we do not want to vote for this party A, we will vote for party B. If there is no alternative, we will create our own platform and make a difference in this democratic, in this bazaar, right? So that people will have a lot of choices or options. Yeah.
Let's talk more about this fragmentation, because like I said, it's a bazaar, a marketplace. Like everyone's shouting here and there, hoping you would pick their stalls and their wares and all that. How did we get to this point of fragmentation? Because if you look at Sarawak, like you mentioned, conventionally they follow one coalition. In Malaya, for many years, it was always either UMNO or opposition DAP or PKR, what have you, right? But in Sabah, it's very unique because there's almost as many parties and candidates as there are, districts in Sabah, right? How did we get to this point of fragmentation? Like, how did we decide that even though everyone's fighting for the same kind of demographic, in some areas, some might focus on particular demographics, right? But the fact is that everyone is competing on the same, in a way, capturing this, like you said, the same Sabah first narrative in a way. Everyone was going for the Sabah first narrative last time round. How is it that even then it's very fragmented?
I think somebody say about the word reset. I like that word. Somebody say Malaysian politics is undergoing a reset. I think Sabah politics is also undergoing a reset, especially after the downfall of strongman politicians like Mustafa or like Haris Saleh. So I think the reset that we are facing is in terms of we don't see any more strongman politicians around. I mean, there's still strong men around, but not as strong as, I mean, where power is concentrated into the hands of just one person, one party, or one coalition. But that is not anymore. That is not happening anymore, right? So we are looking at a situation where our political landscape is changing. To answer your question, how do we arrive at this moment? It's not easy to unpack because structurally our politics is different from Sarawak's, right? Because if you I have just published a paper um, looking at this issue of fermentation. I think one of the major factor is ethnicity, because ethnicity in Sabah is what I call as socially permeable, right? It's not rigid as in Peninsular Malaysia. What do I mean by that? So when you are, of course, you will vote for your own. Um, if let's say you are in a constituency A, you want, and then this constituency is ethnically dominated by one particular ethnic group, you would want the person to represent you come from your own ethnicity, right? But interestingly, in Sabah, there are a lot of constituency where ethnic identity is very fluid. So it does not matter who is standing to represent you, as long as he talks about governance, he talks about MS63, that person will have the opportunity to be elected, right? So that is one of the factors why ethnicity cannot be used as a tool to mobilize support, like what you see in Peninsular Malaysia. Another issue is in terms of the entry point for new political parties in Sabah. It's quite very open. If let's say Adi, you want to form your own political party, you can form it right away. And if you have your own excavator, if you have a lot of money, if you have a van for the disease, right? Um, you can win votes anytime, because in Sabah, personality politics is very strong.
In a way, you have to be a service provider as well.
Yes, service provider. Yeah. Why do you think people go for the adun, right? And the adun are very willingly, they just give money, give their services to the voters, because again, coming back to the idea of the institutions are weak. People don't go to the Malaysia daerah to seek for help, or to the Jabatan Kebajikan to seek for help. They go to the adun. Why? Because institutions are weak. They don't get the help that they want from this institution, but they get it from the adun. So I mean, that's the two factors that I talk about in my article to answer to your question.
Delivery of services. Anyway, power itself is concentrated in the adun, but in a way, the responsibilities as well, right? I mean, first and foremost, an adun is a wakil rakyat, right? As a wakil to the Dewan Dengan Negeri, right? Not exactly what, like you said, the DO service, yeah.
So they should be thinking hard about what law to pass, right? What program to develop for Sabah in order for us to move forward. They shouldn't be doing things like what you are describing. Those things should be done by the local government, the pejabat daerah, the officers at the pejabat daerah. YB is supposed to be thinking about law, dasar or policy and things like that.
You mentioned that mobilizing through ethnic lines is quite neutralized because we're very socially permeable, right? Ethnically permeable. But you've also displayed some skepticism about the Sabah First idea, right? As a mobilizing broad tool for political support. And you said it's been saturated so much that its efficacy has been rendered almost nil in a way, right? You see, like Party Star rode on that very hard, and they only got 2 seats. Even some independent candidates, which were thought to be favorites, also lost, even though they used that kind of platform as well. So no party or coalition is able to fully capitalize it, the way I see it. So how would you see this deadlock develop? Because if everybody's saying it, one side has to give eventually, right? How would you say that deadlock would be broken? How would you predict that would evolve eventually? Because if we go into the next round of state elections, right, they probably we'll see political parties probably say the same slogan again. But how do we break that? How would that deadlock develop?
I think most people now, they have this idea that this Sabah First is used by politicians as a political tool to mobilize support, because they say the same people talking about it, when they are in the government, they don't see anything, right? So by now, I think more people already have this idea that this Sabah First, Sabah for Sabahan, used by politicians, is there as a tool to mobilize support. That's for sure. I think it will continue to be in the conversation, in the public space, to be debated. But the difference, perhaps, in the future is that more civil society movements, NGOs, will look at it in a different angle. Politicians will look at it in an angle where they can get support. But for this third force, I mean, especially the younger generation, when they talk about Sabah First or Sabah for Sabahan, autonomy, the two things that pop up in their mind is whether this can provide them with opportunities or jobs and things like that. So I think in the future, this conversation will continue, but it will happen in a different form. Whether or not our politicians can use this uh, Sabah first or Sabah for Sabahan as a tool to unite, um, that remains to be seen. But I don't think they would want to, because everybody wants to be a champion in fighting for Sabah autonomy in Sabah. Right?
But can you also make the argument that because everybody is using it, it becomes a baseline expectation already? That if you as a political party or politician is not Sabah first, it would be seen as would you say it becomes an expectation already to you have to fight for Sabah rights?
If you operate in Sabah, you want to win the votes of Sabahans, you must put MS63 in your manifesto. That is a must, right? Whether or not you can implement it, that is another issue. But if you want to make a difference, you have to package it well, and you have to be able to implement it in areas where it is easy to implement it. Yeah. So you don't go for things that are difficult to be fulfilled. Yeah. So just go for the low hanging fruits that I was talking about.
So probably we can argue that there's definitely a very pronounced expression of it. It's still very abstract and still hasn't been consolidated into a particular narrative, like you mentioned with Sarawak, right? But it seems that as that expression becomes more pronounced, it would seem that parties like PKR and DAP would be quite obsolete in Sabahan politics, right? If they don't keep up with it. But that's going to be, I feel that's now a source of tension and friction for everyone going to negotiations, right? How would this region, like this, I would say, regionalist sentiment from Sabah, right, affect the general elections down the line? Because I'm sure seat allocations are being negotiated anytime soon. And obviously, the Prime Minister wants to seek for a second term, right? And so he would want to ensure that Sabah and Sarawak is still in the cards here, right? But obviously, Sarawak will go wherever we wind blows. But how can that tension now come to negotiating with Sabah? Because Warisan holds a particular number of seats, GRS holds a particular number of seats, and of course, PKR and DAP would want to retain whatever they have, right, in Sabah, right? How would those tensions be managed come the general election?
I think this use of regional identity as a leverage to negotiate with the federal government, it will have more effect in Sarawak than in Sabah, because it depends on how the political elites in Sabah use this regional sentiment in order to get more concession from the federal government. I mean, we have to accept the fact that the kind of relationship that the Sabah government has with the federal government is transactional, right? You scratch my back and I will scratch yours, right? But then again, it depends on how much concession the federal government would be willing to give. Like, for instance, the issue of 40%. I mean, if not mistaken, the minister in the Prime Minister's department in charge of Sabah and Sarawak affairs, so he said that 1.5 billion will be given to Sabah yearly as an interim payment, right? But whether or not that will satisfy Sabahan or the political elites, that will be another question, right? Because for sure, to pay 40% from the federal coffers, from the perspective of the federal government, will not be financially sustainable, right? They're not going to do that. Either they will pay in phases, or they will just continue to come up with something interim like this, right? And also, let's not forget the fact that GRS only holds 6 seats in parliament. 6, I think, compared to GPS 28. So GPS, obviously, they have more leverage compared to GRS. So I think GRS should be practical about where it can go in terms of trying to get more concession from the federal government. So it should not be too ambitious. It should be, it should be, it should, I think it should uh, move within the context and within the political reality that GRS is in. And GRS does not have to follow GPS, right? That's why coming back to my argument about where it can get the low hanging fruits, go for that one. And once you go for that one, you get the benefits, and you have to tell Sabahans. I think the problem with the JRS government is that perhaps there is not much publicity in terms of what have been gained all these years, right? Through our negotiation with the federal government. But based on my reading on the newspaper announcement from the chief minister, I think we have gained quite a lot, right? We have gained quite a lot, but it's just that it is not well publicized. Not many Sabahans know about this. Yeah.
Framing all that
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
Optics.
Yeah.
Oh, it's right.
Yeah. Look, you mean in Sarawak, they will tell Sarawakians, this is what we get, this is what we will continue to be doing, and things like that. So I think for the sake of it, perhaps Sabah should be following the same way, publicize all the gains that you have from the negotiation from the federal government.
I
Yeah.
want to talk to you about this. We talk about Sabah and Sarawak in its, in isolation in a way, right? But there's always, lurking in the wings, this idea of a Borneo bloc. Where do you see this idea right now? Do you see it moving forward, or do you feel like it's more window dressing? Or because it seems like the tone of the conversation is that Sarawak wants to talk to Sabah more and cooperate more, but Sabah still wants to be more closely with federal government than with Sarawak. But maybe you can disagree with me. What do you feel about the Borneo bloc as it is now?
Borneo block only as an idea, but as a strong grouping, I don't see any movement going towards that kind of arrangement. And I also do not see any Borneo bloc in parliament. Or people say it's Borneo. There's supposed to be a Borneo caucus, like black caucus that you have in the House of in Congress, right? In America, but you don't have that in parliament. It seems like everybody is working separately when it comes to MS63. Interestingly, when you go to Sarawak, you hear some Sarawakian leaders say that they do not want to partner with their Sabahan counterparts because Sabah is so fragile politically, and then there seems to be friendly, like what you said correctly, seems to be friendly to the federal government. Sabah wants to co-op with Sarawak, but Sarawak seems to be quite reluctant. So I think I do not see where this is going to go, and whether or not it will be realized in the near future. But what is possible is for a Borneo caucus in parliament. Create a Borneo caucus. Fight for Borneo cause as one strong grouping, rather than talking about Borneo bloc separately outside of parliament. Of course, people say that we don't have the number, because if you combine Sabah and Sarawak, we only have like what, 56, right?
One top, one test.
Yeah. So in terms of trying to change something that is so substantial in parliament, that will be difficult because we do not have the number. But I think you don't have to wait for that number to come. You only have to come up as a strong group in order to raise your voice, in order to create awareness. What Sabah and Sarawak needs to do is to say to our friends in Peninsular Malaysia that MS63 is not just about Sabah and Sarawak. MS63 is for the whole federation, is for the whole country. So when you give more to Sabah and Sarawak, it does not mean that you will weaken the federation, right? Because that's what federation is all about. Give more autonomy to the constituent states that have certain distinctiveness. Sabah and Sarawak, we have our own distinctiveness. Just imagine ourselves like Quebec, right? That's what Canada is giving to Quebec. So exactly, Sabah and Sarawak are like that. But the peninsula people, most of them, they do not know this. They feel like giving MS63 is like giving more at the expense of Peninsular Malaysia. No, we want to have more because that is already in the MS63. And now that MS63 is already embedded, right, in the federal constitution, what does it say? What does it mean? It means MS63 is now sits at the same par with the other founding documents, which means you cannot talk about Malaysia without MS63. Yeah, so that's what our parliamentarians should be talking.
It's not. Would it be safe to assume that it makes it sound not to try and make it sound like Sabah and Sarawak versus the central government, right? Or um, negotiating with the central government, right? But at the same time, Sabah and Sarawak can go talk to Johor, can talk to Pahang, Kelantan, which also have very strong state identities in their own right, right? To take up a united front, not just from the Borneo side, but from the perspective of federalism, right? The whole point is uh, asymmetric configuration of powers, right? Maybe Kelantan would do better if they have particular powers here and there, right? And we can see under a past state government, they are very happy doing things their own way. And the central government tends to let them be their own way, right? What is, stopping us from, or even Sarawak, talking to Johorians, Kelantanese, Melaccans, or, those are the states.
Um, I think Johor is looking at Sarawak. The region of Johor said that Johor should emulate Sarawak's political unity. But I'm not too sure what did he mean by that. But you are right, because decentralization of power eventually would affect other states, right? So that's why the whole thing about changing or rejuvenating, whatever word you want to say, right? Um, should involve other states as well. It's not really just about Sabah and Sarawak, because if, for instance, more concessions are given to Sabah and Sarawak, of course, the other states in Peninsular Malaysia, they will start voicing out, right?
Mhm.
Power should also be given to us. So
Mhm.
that's why the discussion about restructuring the federal government should also be wholly packaged so that it involves other states as well. Like what I mentioned to you earlier, we want to restructure, we should look at areas where powers can be decentralized to the states rather than just concentrated in the hands of the federal government. Yeah.
W- to just talk about, let's go back to Sarawak for a bit, right? Of course, we're jumping all over the place, right? But on this, I would say, enigmatic idea of Sarawakian unity, which seems to always, in a way, beguile Sabahans, right? Like, oh, you see, Sarawak is so united, right? Is there anything you can offer in terms of challenging that notion? Is it really as we think from this side of Borneo that, oh, Sarawak really is united? And or is there cracks that you can see being in Sarawak that maybe outsiders are unable to observe?
Okay. I think somehow we probably we look at us Sabahans. When you look at Sabahans, we look at ourselves as disunited. But I don't think that's true. Politically, we may be disunited, but beyond politics, we are not. Why I say so? Because I've been in Peninsular Malaysia for many years. So whenever Sabahans meet each other, I mean, they always talk about how unique Sabahan are in terms of our identity, right? And if you come here, I don't see any obvious divisions among Sabahans. But the good thing is that because regional identity is not so strong, Sabahans' identities are very fluid. So when we look at each other, we don't look at you. I mean, I don't look at you differently. You are from a different culture or different ethnicities. I look at you as purely Sabahan, right? So I don't see any issue in terms of unity or disunity in the Sabahan context. But if you look at Sarawak, you I think we should go back again to what we discussed earlier about that sense of belonging, sense of regional identity. That seems to be stronger because that's already embedded in the Sarawakian in the society over there, and that's strengthened by the politician, by the political elites. Yeah.
Not to mention that Sarawak has every right to feel like they're riding a huge wave of momentum, right? Oftentimes, Sabah and Sarawak are considered the kingmakers for a general election, right? But recently, as a result of Johor and Negeri Sembilan recently, Parti Bangsa Malaysia claimed that GPS and GRS might lose their kingmaker status because the combined Barisan Nasional and Perikatan Nasional pact could theoretically secure 112 seats and form a federal majority independently from Sabah and Sarawak. Obviously, that's a very bold claim to make. considering everything critically succeeds. But obviously, elections are very messy, right? People jump here and there. There are X factors you cannot account for. What would be your thoughts on this statement when it comes to kingmaker status for Sabah and Sarawak?
That might be true, and that might not be true. Even though they are strong there at the federal level, that doesn't mean that they would not listen to Sabah and Sarawak. I think still for the federal government, Sabah and Sarawak are still indispensable politically. And not only that, because when they become strong at the federal level, they are representing the federal government. And the idea of the federal government is to respect differences, right? To respect distinctiveness. And they know that that is coming from Sabah and Sarawak. So they can't ignore us altogether, even though they are strong there at the federal level. But if you look at the political numbers, I would say you are right. GPS or GPS will continue to support whoever is in power at the federal level. I think that would be the same for GRS. I do not think GRS or GPS would want to be on the other side of the political aisle. They still want to be in the government, because only with the government of the day they would be able to fulfill MSCC3 and gain more benefits from MSCC3. Yeah, so um, the equation will be the same, I think. Status quo. Whoever is in power at the federal level will not affect us that much, because we will want to be in the same boat as those people who hold power at the federal government.
It's not easy being an opposition state, right? Not easy being an opposition state. No one wants to be in the opposition. Yes, exactly. Yeah. I mean, when we look at, let's say, Sabah politics, right? When relative to Sarawak, Sarawak is very assertive. Sabah is still quite, like I said, transactional, play nice with the federal government. And an argument can be made is that a lot of Sabahan leaders were part of that cohort of the Barisan National days where government is so centralized. So it can be quite of a more differential cohort, right? But eventually they're going to be phased out, and we're going to see another generation of leaders from Sabah. And maybe a lot of people are banking on that next generation of leaders who are more exposed to ideas of Sabahan nationalism, state identity, regionalism. Would you say that would make a huge shift in Sabah politics, or would that be marginal differences?
I think among the young generation of leaders, there will be differences in terms of ideas, in terms of approaches. As I mentioned to you earlier, MSCC3 will be here to stay, autonomy will be here to stay. But then again, the question is, how is this going to be translated into more tangible policy programs that can give jobs, opportunities, especially to the young people of Sabahan or Sarawakians? I think the essence is still there, but the way it is being carried on will be different. The approaches will be different, but the idea will be the same. What is promising for me, at least, in my conversation with my student from Sabah and Sarawak, I think the issue of secession is still there. They still talk about secession, the possibility of uh, seceding from the federation is still there. But what is promising is this: they start to think about how to make the federation work, like what they see in Canada, in Australia, or even in the States, right? The US federations that have survived many tribulations or challenges, but yet they keep themselves together as a nation, as a federal state. I think this is very promising. I think so. They start to think about, okay, how do we make sure that this Malaysian federation remain intact despite all these tensions, differences, Sabah, Sarawak, Johor, and things like that. So when that question arises, I think that will lead us to something that is positive, because now we are not talking about secession anymore. We're talking about how do we remain in this federation, what we need to do so that we can manage these differences better. Yeah, that kind of conversation. Yeah.
One point I would like to bring up is when I look at, let's say, any kind of literature, scholarly material on, let's say, autonomy, right? Yours included, I mean, there's Bridget as well, Prof. James Chin as well, all these people who write on Sabah and Sarawak, right? I mean, this comes from being able to analyze and explain what's going on in Sabah and Sarawak, right? But I would like to make a point that there is a lack of theoreticians in Sabah, a lack of scholars that try to philosophize or try to theorize what does Sabahan identity mean within a federation, right? Or try to define the parameters of what Sabah should be within the federation, right? Would you agree that this is a apt assessment of our academic landscape or even a public discourse landscape? Because you mentioned the CSOs and all that, and they do great work organizing these seminars and forums, right? But rarely do you see, how would you say, mobilizing ideals about these things. Like, okay, we talk about autonomy, MA63, but what does that translate to as a tangible or able to visualize that idea or even abstract the idea? Would you say that that's a deficiency we have?
In some point, we don't talk much about identity, about nation building, even though these two are quite important. You hear people from Peninsular Malaysia talk about nation building, talk about identity. But here in Sabah, you hear people talking about Sabahan identity or even Sarawakian identity, but not as theoretically embedded as what you may want it to be, right? That is why this should be started with the civil society organization. The conversation should be continued to talk about, if you want to talk about identity, nation building, where should we start? Because it seems like in Malaysia at the moment, we have these three competing visions to our national identity. So you have the Islamist version, you have the secular constitutional vision, and you have that Borneo vision, right? So three big uh, different visions for the Malaysian state. So how do you reconcile this? For instance, this discussion should be continued. Nation building, I think, is a continuous process. In fact, when Malaysia was formed in 1963, I think our founding fathers had no time to talk about what kind of Malaysia they wanted to be, right? They had no time to discuss about nation building. For them, what was important was for the Malaysian state to form. That's it. Uh, Whether or not you want Malaysia to be A, B, and C, they left that to us to decide. That is why this whole idea, notion of Malaysian identity, Sabahan or Sarawakian identity should be continuously discussed or theorized. Yeah, why not?
Because when I look at in Peninsula, it's a very vibrant intellectual community. You have, the late Uncle Aziz was there, Farish Noor as well, right? But I mean, I don't want to make the assumption.
Over here in Sabah, a lot of the discussion center around grievances, right? We are the party that is being neglected or marginalized. I think I'm not saying that that is not important. That is important. But then again, we have to shift our discussion, right, from historical grievances to moving forward. Now we are here. Where do we want to go? What are we going to do with it? Historical grievances, we have been talking about this already, right, since time immemorial. But what are we going to do with that now, right? What is our action plan, program moving forward? I think that would be more productive than talking about all this erosion, grievances, blaming here, blaming there. So that will not be productive for
There's
us.
a lot of, in a way, MA63 fundamentalists who wants us to be exactly how it was envisioned. But let's take tourism, for example. That was never a part of MA63, right? And no one would imagine that Sabah will become a tourism hotspot. So, of course, now Sarawak's talking about devolving tourism to them. Even though we have a tourism ministry here, of course, we want more rights for tourism, right? So it's these kinds of, I mean, in a way, it circles back to education. That well, universities here are mostly headed under federal ministry, right? then how can we cultivate that intellectual space or the intellectual chamber in a way? How can we channel that? Of course, you said CSO, right? But what kind of other methods or avenues can we use to cultivate that intellectual vibrancy?
I mean, the easiest way is working with the third force. Coming back to the role of the NGOs, civil society movement, because these NGOs and civil society movements, they are not constrained by system, right? They are not constrained by bureaucracy, not constrained by routine in government, right? So they can start with a intellectual discussion like this, right? And then you can work with the universities, work with students, progressive minded people or leaders, bring them here in your podcast and talk about this. This should be continuously done. Don't stop. Yeah, because if you look at what happened in Peninsular Malaysia 1999 onwards, right, until the fall of the Barisan National Government and the rise of PR. So who was behind this? Organization like Bersih and the other NGOs, civil society movements were very, very vibrant. So I think for Sabah, we should have that. We should have that. So in Sabah, the third force should play a more meaningful role in order to make a difference. Yeah, so that's where we can start.
I wanted to end off by asking what you think about the next decade. But you meant about Sabah politics, but you already mentioned stuff like the role of the CSO, NGOs, MA63 and autonomy will be here to stay, right? But are they, I don't know, more underrated nuances that we, maybe Sabahans or Malaysians, have sort of neglected? Are there other undercurrents that we may not be so, we're not paying so much attention to that maybe you've observed?
Um, well, we already discussed about this, but I want to reiterate it once again. We are an evolving democracy. Democracy in Sabah is very dynamic, but it's just that we don't tap into that. We don't look at that as our strength, but instead we look at that democratic openness as a setback. So I think it's time for Sabahans from different professional backgrounds, from different political parties, to look at this uniqueness that we have as our strengths and as our assets, to tap into and use that to strengthen our institutions, strengthen the democratic space in order to develop Sabah. You may say I'm very idealistic, right? I think it's okay to be idealistic because when you look at the society in Sabah, especially the younger generation, they are more openness, they are more critical on the social media. I mean, you see demonstration, even though I may not agree with what they are demonstrating about. But my point is, let's use our democratic space um, effectively, meaningfully, in order to develop a better Sabah.
Definitely. I like the idea of idealism because, good, ideas don't spring up from cynicism, right? Cynicism is the death of potential. And I'm thank you so much, Doctor, for sharing that with us. And definitely more ideas to be had. Definitely, if you like what Dr. Arnold has said and shared with us today, please let us know in the comment section down below. This is the Sabah Matters podcast brought to you by Daily Express, and definitely there's more conversations that we can have. I like the idea of this being a cultivation for intellectual discussion, and we hope that is what we can bring to you to the viewers and the listeners of Daily Express. So if you want any more, please let us know, or even recommend to us what kind of guests you would like to see. Would you want to see? I mean, well, we had Morenos before, we had Terry also before, influencers and all that, so on and so forth. And we also have academicians like yourself, Doctor. We had with other academicians before. So we want this to be a place where we can have these kinds of, I guess, rigorous conversations about Sabah. So thank you so much, Doc, for coming in, and we'll see you all on the next episode.